Happy Trails Through Daybreak worldwide release, everyone! I hope you're ready to join Van on the Arc ride of a lifetime. But wait, I thought the game was called Kuro no Kiseki, or Trails Before Dawn? Trails in the Dark? Every game in the Trails series has an English and a Japanese title, and some of them even have more than one English one. So what's the deal with all that? What do the titles mean? Are the English ones direct translations of the Japanese ones, or something else? And what's the significance behind each title, beyond just sounding kinda cool? All that and more will be answered in this video, which is going to go in original Japanese release order of games in the series. So we will be starting with Sky, then doing Crossbell, then Cold Steel, and then the new Calvard Arc. With the exception of the Daybreak games that most of you haven't gotten to play in English yet, I do think it's fair to warn you about spoilers for each successive arc. While I won't be directly talking about most plot details outside of maybe Crossbell, a lot of the titles in the series do have relevance to important story moments or characters that are obviously very frequently spoilers, so I wouldn't recommend watching part of a video about an arc until you've at least been spoiled on the general plot points, even if you haven't played it yet. Basically, if you've played all of Cold Steel, you can probably watch the Crossbell stuff without getting additional spoilers, but if you don't know anything about who Lloyd Bannings is, stay away. Additionally, it is very worth noting that while I will be attempting to explain the Japanese titles of the series in addition to the English ones, I am not fluent in that language. That is to say, I did more research into this than just looking up each of the kanji in the titles on Jisho to ensure I knew what I'm talking about, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm correct in every single case, or that I didn't miss some dialectical slang or cultural reference that someone who actually knows the language would. I think I caught everything based on cross-referencing with other people trying to explain the titles, and other people's theorizing about titles in upcoming games back when they were new, but I am fallible. Don't be surprised if not everything I say here is 100% correct, and if you do legitimately know better, feel free to correct me in the comments. I'm also not going to give you baby's first Japanese lesson here, so I hope you know how kanji, hiragana, and katakana work before watching the video, because I don't feel like explaining that. You might think it's time to immediately jump into Trails in the Sky, but before we can get hiking on any trails, we have to discuss the name of this series as a whole, as Trails is a sub-series of The Legend of Heroes, and The Legend of Heroes is technically a spin-off of Dragon Slayer, Falcom's original action RPG hit. Now, there's nothing interesting to say about Dragon Slayer. Its Japanese name is Dragon Slayer in katakana, so its English name is Dragon Slayer. It's about slaying dragons, that's why it's called that. It's a bit more interesting though when we get to The Legend of Heroes, as while it is very frequently displayed in English text as The Legend of Heroes, and I will be referring to the Japanese logos of Trails games a lot throughout this video, so get used to seeing them. In some older games pre-Trails, as well as the original Japanese logos for the Trails in the Sky trilogy, it is instead written in these four kanji, which make up two words, Eiyu Densetsu. And while we are looking at kanji for the first time in the video, it is pretty much a direct translation into The Legend of Heroes. Eiyu is one of two commonly used words in Japanese to mean hero in like a legendary or historical sense, and densetsu just means a legend or tradition. These are both relatively common words that you've probably heard in other Japanese media before. For example, the Japanese name of the Legend of Zelda series is Zelda no Densetsu, and the classic anime The Legend of the Galactic Heroes is Ginga Eiyu Densetsu, so this is pretty well tread ground for translating this exact term in this exact way. Leaving the realm of direct translations, we move on to the format the title of each game in the series takes. In Japanese, the format is blank no Kiseki, where the blank is a noun or verb written with only one kanji. In English, this is a bit more complicated, as the format is instead Trails blank blank, where both blanks change with the arc. The first one being a preposition, and the second one being the noun or verb that's referencing the title. The main difference between English and Japanese is that while Japanese uses the preposition no, directly translating to of, though it can have other uses, for every title, the preposition in English changes every time the kanji in Japanese does. Hence, Trails in the Sky, Trails from Zero, Trails to Azure, and so forth. This allows the people coming up with the English titles a bit more freedom in finding something that sounds good, instead of using a more direct of every single time, which would lead to more rigidity and a lot of dry, not so interesting sounding titles. The process of changing no to different prepositions was started when Xseed localized the original Trails in the Sky, and the practice of changing preposition each time was set in stone when they made Sen no Kiseki into Trails of Cold Steel, while at the same time already having the titles Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure in use internally when referring to potentially localizing the Crossbell games. Pretty much everyone after them who's taken a significant stab at translating a Trails game has followed this pattern, not just NIS America, the new official localization studio, but also every relevant fan translation group on games after Cold Steel. The Geofront Crossbell fan translations, which were started at a period in time after Xseed had lost the license to the series and before NISA had picked it up, even used Xseed's tentative Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure, and then when NISA picked up those fan translations, they used the same. We definitely shouldn't be talking about Crossbell so much yet, though, because, well, we have to get to Sky before we can do that, and we can't get to Sky until I explain the Kiseki part of the title. There are 2 words in Japanese that are pronounced Kiseki and use 2 kanji, but obviously only one of them can be used in the title of the series, though the fact that it has a homonym with a different meaning is definitely intentional. The writing used in the titles is this one, which means track in the sense that the track left behind by, like, your horse and cart, the traces that someone's left behind, or the path you have taken. And you can definitely see how this was translated to Trails. I do think Trails sounds a bit better than Tracks as the name of a series, and gets the metaphorical type of trails across a little bit better than Tracks, which might be a little confusing when compared to, like, race tracks or running tracks, and especially train tracks come Cold Steel. Another place you might have seen this word recently is in the first Freerun opening, which officially translates it to Tracks, which again is another valid and technically more accurate translation. Incidentally, the title of that song is Yusha, which is the other commonly used Japanese word for hero, and the one used to describe Himmel the hero, so unfortunately it seems Freerun's quest before Journey's End was a Yusha densetsu, and, well, not a Falcom game apparently. I'd still definitely play a Falcom Freerun game. Make that after the next Tokyo Xanadu. Another common translation of this Kiseki is trajectory. This one shows up a lot in machine translation from Chinese instead of Japanese material for whatever reason, and I don't know why. Sometimes it will say tracks, sometimes it will say path, sometimes it will say trajectory, sometimes it will say trails when you're going from Japanese, but if you do from Chinese, it will only say trajectory or just get it correct as trails. I don't know what to make of this. Anyway, the other Kiseki is this one. Same second kanji, but swaps the first one out, and this one means miracle. Given the fact that there's a goddess afoot in Zemuria, and myths and religion play a very important role throughout the series, it was definitely intentional on Falcom's part to give the series a name that has multiple potential meanings when said out loud. For example, Sora no Kiseki, which I promise I will get to the first part of in a minute, could be read as Trails in the Sky, and that is the correct reading if you're looking at the kanji, but if you don't have that in front of you, you could also interpret it as miracle in the sky, which is definitely an accurate description for certain events in the Sky Arc. Unfortunately, this double meaning is something that's basically impossible to translate into English while still having a working video game title, as you would need 2 words that are pronounced the same that mean something similar to Trails and something similar to Miracle, and to the best of my knowledge, that simply does not exist in this language, so there is a little bit of meaning lost by no fault of any translator that's ever touched a title in the series. Alright, we did it. We got to Trails in the Sky. I think we can start speeding up just a little bit now that we're just talking about individual kanji. The Sora in Sora no Kiseki is this one, and this is a fairly straightforward translation, as the most common reading of this kanji, at least when pronounced Sora, is sky or heaven. And yes, that does also mean you can read the title of Trails in the Sky as Miracle in the Heavens. Now I think is a good time to mention that most of the kanji you will see throughout the rest of this video have multiple different pronunciations, often with different meanings for each one, but we know as a fact which one was intended by Falcom even outside of press releases or trailers, because the Japanese logos for each game in the series actually include furigana that tell you how to pronounce everything. The location and stylization is a bit different, and as before, Sky is an exception, But for most of the series, this takes the form of blank no Kiseki being written in katakana somewhere on the logo below the kanji. And like I said before, the Sky Trilogy are the only games in the series that have Eiyu Densetsu written in kanji above the main title. Every game after that, starting with Zero, just has The Legend of Heroes written in English. Zero came out before the first Sky localization, but this was not Falcom choosing a preferred English title for the series at the time, as several previous entries, the PSP Gagarv games, and even one version of the original Dragon Slayer Legend of Heroes, were localized under that name already. The Udon Entertainment localizations of the Sky and Crossbell art books are notoriously bad in terms of just pure translation and getting official romanizations wrong. Imagine doing that in the actual games, Nisa! But they were actually released in 2012, which means in between Azure and Cold Steel 1 on the Japanese side, but in between Sky First Chapter and Sky Second Chapter on the localization side, meaning when rendering the titles of the games in English, it gets Trails in the Sky correct, but couldn't predict what people would be calling Zero no Kiseki and Ao no Kiseki several years in the future, so it calls them Trails of Zero and Trails of Blue. Before we can move on to Zero, though, a few other Sky-related things. Firstly, the same kanji for Sora is used as the Japanese name for the space element, which means you can also kind of read the title as Miracle in Space, and hey, guess which Septarian the Sky Arc ends up being about. Secondly, while we've talked a lot about the Miracle in the Sky, what exactly are the Trails in the Sky? This is where we get into a sub-theme of the Trails series. Each arc doesn't just focus on a different location and different cast of characters, but there's also a different central mode of transport in each arc in the series. The one in the Liberal arc is obviously the airship, so Trails in the Sky also refer to the contrails left behind by airships as they go through the sky, and probably specifically in this case, the Trails of the Glorious, the Arcee, and the Bobcat. And lastly, just a note about subtitles. Why is it first chapter and second chapter, but then the third instead of third chapter? This is just because Falcom pulled a Falcom when they were making the Sky games. It was originally supposed to just be one game, but it got too big, and they were running out of time, so they had to release something in a year, so they split it in two. They did this with the original Ys, and they ended up doing this 2 more times just within the Trails series after this. The third was an entirely separate project from the beginning, and only came into existence after they decided to make the Trails series an ongoing thing, and not just have the 2 Sky games as the next entry in the Legend of Heroes. We have officially made it to Crossbell. Finally. And guess what? There are 2 different kanji for this arc, so we're gonna go very quickly through the first one, especially because I don't have much to say this time. The kanji used for Trails from Zero is this one. And this is a very simple deal, another extremely direct translation, as when used as a word on its own, this does just mean zero or nothing. This kanji does have a Japanese pronunciation of rei, but the furigana in the title do confirm it is supposed to be pronounced zero like the word in English. So very obviously this is the correct translation because they literally use an English word just representing it with kanji. Zero here represents multiple things. The special support section starting from zero and trying to win the approval of Crossbell's citizens when they're given zero support and have an uphill battle to fight, as well as the idea of starting over from zero. Not just in terms of most of the characters' arcs, but also because the actions of a certain Zero child cause things to play out again in a different way. There's also the transportation theme of this arc. While there are buses and cars in Crossbell, the special support section starts out their work on foot, walking around the city and countryside of the land they now serve. This is perhaps the most literal use of the word trails in a title because they are literally walking a trail from zero to get to a place they can overcome barriers from. As for the second game in the arc, the Japanese title is Ao no Kiseki, using this kanji here. And this one you've probably heard of the common pub trivia fact that, oh, there's no distinction between the colors blue and green in Japanese, it's all Ao. And while that's not strictly true, it is close enough for the purposes of explaining the title, as it is intending to reference the color and nothing else. If you've tried learning kanji before, you might be a little confused. This is the second most common kanji that can be read as ao and means blue or green. The other, more simple one is used in general speech. This one is more used in proper names, so some variations of the name Aoi might use this. I wanted to check for characters who are named Aoi who use this. My first thoughts were Jujutsu Kaisen and Yuru Camp. Neither of them use that. Aoi Todo uses a different kanji that doesn't mean the color, and Aoi Inuyama just writes it in hiragana, but I did learn that she has the same birthday as me, so that's kind of neat. Okay, editing Luxon here. How did I not realize this is the kanji that Aoi Yuki uses in her first name? It is the most important of these kanji because it's the Finch one. How did I not know this? Anyway, this got translated as Trails to Azure, largely because every time the word ao is used as a color, regardless of which kanji is used, it is always translated as Azure, no matter who is translating it. Literally every official and fan translation I've ever used has done this every time this word has shown up in Japanese. It probably helps that there are other words for blue and green used throughout the series that are translated just as regular blue and green, but it is genuinely a small meme among the fanbase that Azure is like the only word for blue that exists in Zemuria. Now, where this came from specifically is likely the translation of the first Cold Steel game, as it came out before the official Trails in the Sky, the third one, and this is the first instance of Azure being used in official terminology throughout the series. There is a character with Azure in their title that appears in the first Cold Steel game, and while that is pronounced Ao, it does use a third kanji, second one for use in names, that means bluish colors, and this was translated as Azure, so likely the same people at Exceed who were responsible for that translation also came up with Azure as a tentative translation for the second Crossbell game at the same time, and everyone since basically stuck with that. Except actually, I think they worked backwards here, and the idea to use Azure in the title of the Cold Steel character came about after tentatively deciding on Trails to Azure as a name for Ao no Kiseki. And that is because of something very important that we haven't talked about yet. The titles of songs on the OSTs of the Trails series. A lot of these titles are in English, and from them, you can get what clearly seem to be Falcom's intended translations for important pieces of terminology. In fact, the final boss theme of Ao no Kiseki is called the Azure Arbitrator in English, which suggests that Falcom always intended Azure to be the English translation of the color they were hinting at by using Ao a bunch of different places in the game. Choosing to as the preposition to make the title Trails to Azure in English makes perfect sense, as the final area of the game has Azure in its name, and the entire plot of the Crossbell Arc revolves around something called the Azure Zero Project, which does use both kanji from the titles of the two games in its Japanese name. In addition, going from Zero to Azure makes sense because if the characters did not start from Zero, they would never have made it to Azure at the end of the second game in the first place. Okay, we have arrived at Trails of Cold Steel, and this is going to be the most complicated one by far, as out of all the titles, this is the least directly translated one in the entire series. The primary reason for this is that the word used in its Japanese name, sen, using this kanji, doesn't have a direct English translation, as nothing that comes close is a very good idea for something to put in a game title. While when used in other words in combination with other kanji, it can mean flash in general, like a flash of light from something, sen on its own commonly has a more specific meaning of the flash of light when a blade is drawn. This of course fits for the arc where your protagonist is an 8 Leaves user, but how do you condense that into an actual word in English? Well, the regular battle theme in Cold Steel 1 is called The Glint of Cold Steel in English, and glint, I think, would actually be a fairly appropriate translation for sen in the sense of the light on a flickering blade. Directly stealing the term Cold Steel from the soundtrack allows the title to have 3 different meanings in English, which when combined do for the most part capture the original meaning in Japanese. The first is Rin's trail, his path to mastery of the 8 Leaves, which would be a trail of cold steel, as that is a term frequently used to describe weaponry. The second is the path taken by a marching army, Cold Steel takes place at a military academy and is generally a more military-themed arc when compared to both Sky and Crossbell. Also, wars just straight up happen in this arc more than any other in the series, so if you're going to have anything reference the movement of large armies, this would be the one. And then the final thing would be referencing literal trails of Cold Steel on the ground of Erebonia. Train tracks, as the train is the signature mode of transport for this arc. If you think I'm stretching with the whole modes of transport thing, I'm absolutely not. There's a shot in the OP of Cold Steel 4 that literally cuts from the sky to train tracks to a road, very obviously referencing all of the arcs and the paths the protagonists have come to uniting here. I actually know what I'm talking about, I promise. This is all well and good, and was basically my entire thought process for why this exact change was made, and then I also found an old blog from 2015 on Xseed's site about localizing the first Cold Steel game, and lo and behold, this was more or less the exact thought process the localization team had when they were deciding on the name, because they definitely knew not to go literal because that would just sound stupid. One thing I didn't know about is that when the localization team proposed this title to the Japanese staff at Falcom, they were told that Falcom had been considering Steel to be part of the title of this arc from the beginning in Japanese, so not only is this a pretty good compromise and approximation of what the Japanese title was going for without breaking the naming conventions of games in the series, and not only was it approved by the original creators of the Japanese script, but it also was very close to what they were going to call the game in Japanese anyway, so I think it's hard to find any major complaints about this specific choice. One choice that I am going to question is the abject removal of Trails of Cold Steel 4's subtitle in the English version. If you look at the Sen no Kiseki 4 logo, you will notice that it is subtitled End of Saga in English. And then if you go to the Trails of Cold Steel 4 logo, you will notice that it doesn't have a subtitle at all. Why did they do this? I don't know. Ultimately though, this is a small change, and NISA didn't get to prove themselves when localizing Trails titles for several more entries, because the next two they came out with were the official releases of Zero and Azure, which were so heavily based on the Geofront fan translations that already called them Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure, as fans had been doing for like half a decade at this point, so there was really no reason to change them. The first time they got to come up with an English name themselves was for their localization of Nayuta no Kiseki, the action game spin-off of the Trails series. This one, they localized as The Legend of Nayuta Boundless Trails. And while this technically isn't a good translation, there was basically nothing they could do about it in this case. This is because the kanji they chose for Nayuta, which is the only time in the series they use more than one, using 3 here, translates to a very large number, so a literal reading of the title is just a large amount of trails. In this case, Nayuta can just mean an arbitrarily large number, so taking that as boundless trails makes sense. The trails themselves aren't boundless, the amount of them is. The issue is that Nayuta is also the name of the main character of the game, albeit spelled in katakana this time, so an alternative reading of the title is also this specific character's path or his miracle. How do you get that across in English? Well, since this technically isn't a mainline Trails game, it doesn't have the Legend of Heroes in it, so they repurposed the Legend of Heroes and turned it into the Legend of Nayuta the character, while also directly translating the kanji meaning of Nayuta no Kiseki. I think this is a pretty good case of doing the best with what they're given, because there was no way to directly translate this again, just like with the Japanese name of Cold Steel. Alright, that was the first title of a Trails game that NISA got to localize themselves, and they did a pretty decent job with it. Next up is Hajimari no Kiseki, another mainline entry, and just as, if not a bigger one than Cold Steel 4 in terms of scope and implications. Starting with the Japanese, the first thing to point out is that the furigana in the logo are in hiragana and not katakana this time. It's only like it in this game. I have no idea why they did it. It goes back to katakana in the very next one. This still says Hajimari no Kiseki. They just did this for no reason. I've never been able to find a good explanation for this, but I guess that's kind of beside the point. Anyway, this is the kanji used in the title, which is curious because it's not frequently used in the actual word Hajimari when it is written out. That word primarily uses this kanji, and its meaning is basically the start or beginning of something. This shouldn't be a surprise. If you've experienced any anime or games in sub, you've probably heard a word that uses the Haji root and means something that has to do with beginning things, but it's in this unorthodox kanji choice where things get interesting, as this can also mean origin and is frequently used in other words that have to do with creation, including that of the divine variety, which means that this isn't just trails of the beginning, but trails of the beginning, or trails of origin, trails of genesis, trails of creation. All of these interpretations make a lot of sense. There is the origin of a lot of things explored in this game. There is divine creation in this game, and all of this is touched on, while also being a new beginning for the series after the end of saga that was Cold Steel 4. It is a little difficult to consolidate this into one English title, especially without reusing a preposition that's used before. I mean, if you did want to stretch your thesaurus a bit, you could technically call it Trails from Zero again and not be an inaccurate translation, but something tells me that might be a bad idea. So, something like Trails Across Creation, Trails Through Genesis, Trails Beyond Beginnings, all would sound really cool and fit perfectly. What did Nisa do? Well, they employed a brand new technique that no one making a localized Trails title ever has done before. And this was the technique of literally not trying at all. They called it Trails into Revery, which, as you might note, has nothing to do with Hajimari no Kiseki, other than the Kiseki part still being translated as Trails. Where did they get this from? Well, there's something in Cold Steel 2 called the Revery Corridor, and this type of mechanic was brought back as the true Revery Corridor in Hajimari no Kiseki. Instead of being an area where the post-game story of the game is dedicated, it's something that all three routes can access during the story and also contains post-game stuff after you've beaten it. So, because everyone, all three routes, go into the Revery Corridor at different points during the story, they called it Trails into Revery, even though nothing that has to do with the Revery Corridor is directly connected to the main plot of Trails into Revery. Basically, I started being fan translation only for Trails games after Cold Steel 4, and there's a good reason why I immediately was able to adjust to calling Kuro no Kiseki Trails through Daybreak, but I will still refer to Revery as Hajimari most of the time. Oh, right, yeah, wow, we're at Kuro no Kiseki now. I can start talking about that. This is probably my favorite one to discuss in the entire series. Cool. At first blush, you might think Trails Through Daybreak is a very weird translation for Kuro no Kiseki, because it's Kuro. That means black in Japanese. The title translates to Trails of Black. But that is just not true. The kanji used in the title has a bunch of different pronunciations and a bunch of different meanings, but the most common pronunciation is not Kuro, and the most common meaning is not the color black. This Kuro's primary pronunciation is Rei, both in terms of actually relating to darkness or the color black, and in other contexts, as it can also mean many, and is used in a couple different words for commoners or the masses, the common folk, large amounts of people. I don't think those are super relevant to the game, but the most important time this kanji is used, and it is pronounced Rei there, is when combined with the kanji for bright, as this forms the word Reimei, or daybreak, the dawn of day, or even the dawn of an era, the gray morning light. There's not a perfect one-to-one thing here, but the fact that it's specifically the daybreak part of dawn, and they're taking the first kanji in it, the beginning of daybreak, which can also mean darkness when used on its own, pronouncing it as the color black and putting that in the title suggests that what they're going for is something similar to the English phrase, the darkness before the dawn, or it's always darkest before the dawn, indicating that these are trails through darkness sometimes. They're not always the righteous, just, or even good path, and there's a lot of ambiguity, but that taking these trails always means there will be a light to come. And this is absolutely perfect for everything about the game. Blue is also a color that is frequently associated with the time right before the sun actually comes up, and this is fit in as well, as the game basically invents a new reading of this kanji, Aoguroi, meaning bluish black, and this is even in the Japanese title of Vaughn's Grendel form. the demonic gear clad in blue-black darkness. And this is because the way Spriggans, the way Von Goddamn Arkwright operates, isn't something as simple as black and white morality. All this said and done though, why did they specifically go with Kuro and not Rei no Kiseki? Well, this is because of something that hasn't been confirmed yet, as of Daybreak 2 even, so what I'm going to say is speculation, not even spoilers. And that is that they're going back to the thing they did in Sky, where the name of the Septarian involved in the arc is hidden in plain sight in the title of the game. And that is because the katakana spelling of Kuro no is written identically to the katakana writing of the term chrono, as in chrono Kiseki, chrono trails, trails of time, miracle of time. This is the exact same formula used in Trails in the Sky when they were talking about the Septarian of Space. It is extremely likely that this was an intended Easter egg in the title because really, if you think about it, basically every title I've talked about so far has had something like this. So of course the first game in the Calvert arc would have one too. We also have a pretty good idea of what intended English name for the game Falcom was working with, as the ending theme of Trails Through Daybreak 1 is called Kuro Beyond the Dawn in English. Alright, that's all well and good, but two things. One, they were given such an easy layup, why is the English title not Trails Through the Dawn? And two, why am I not complaining about this at all? That's highly out of character for Nisa screwing up, right? Well, they have a very, very good reason for it not being called Trails Through the Dawn. And that is simply because yeah, Final Fantasy XIV's 5th expansion being called Dawn Trail was revealed roughly a month before Nisa formally revealed that they would be localizing Kuro no Kiseki, and the logo they showed off is different from the final logo the release version of the game has, to the point where its visual and color balancing is a little off, and would be fixed if Daybreak was replaced with a shorter word, and Trails Through had something next to it. Like, this was clearly a logo that said Trails Through the Dawn that they had to very, very quickly change to say Daybreak because that was their second choice and there was literally no way they could do their first. In fact, it got significantly worse for them as Trails Through Daybreak is now releasing a week and 2 days after Dawn Trail, which means it's going to get buried by it anyway because, well, Final Fantasy big IP, Trails small niche IP, and not even because of anything they did wrong. But yeah, Daybreak is a synonym for Dawn that also sounds appropriately cool and epic for a video game title, so as a second choice goes, this is fantastic. People were calling it Trails Before Dawn long before the official name was announced, and I was calling it Trails Before Daybreak because I thought that sounded cooler, so I basically won with this choice. You're welcome. Another reason why I'm so sure the original name was going to be Dawn is because in a minigame in Hajimari no Kiseki, you have to answer quiz questions about the series, and one of those questions is actually about the Japan-only, now-defunct gacha game Akatsuki no Kiseki. In the localization, instead of either deleting the question, changing it to something that would make sense for an English speaker, or just leaving the name as is because it never got localized, Nisa instead decided to give it a localized name, Trails at Sunrise. So yeah, we actually have another game to talk about that you probably weren't expecting. Akatsuki uses this kanji, which yes, is actually 4 entire syllables when used on a word on its own. And this does in fact also mean dawn or daybreak, but it's also used in the Japanese name for the planet Venus, the morning star, and for a bunch of words revolving around dawn and its light. Basically, it more refers to the part of dawn after the sun has already come up. Now, a reasonable translation for this would be Trails at Dawn. And in fact, this was the preferred fan translation for basically the entire time before Revery came out. There weren't any of Nisa's usual reasons to not use a fan term here either. First off, Nisa never did a localization of it, and obviously now that it's EOS'd, never will. And B, there was never a fan translation of it, so they wouldn't run into any issues by using a fan name because there's no way that would ever direct you to some technically illegal fan translation. And yet, instead of just taking the community name, they used Trails at Sunrise, and obviously, as I already displayed, Sunrise is a good alternate dawn synonym to use here, and also kind of goes along with the fact that Akatsuki in Akatsuki no Kiseki is pronounced the same as Akatsuki, or Red Moon, which very much fits with sunrise or there being light around already than something like Daybreak. Basically what I'm saying is, in the Revery localization, they went out of their way to not use the word dawn in the title of a Trails game, when it would have been easier to do so, which suggests that they were intentionally saving it for use in the future, and very obviously based on timing, they would have already known they would be localizing Kuro by the time Revery's script was finalized. Then of course, much later they got Yoshi peed on and had to move to Plan B, but I like Plan B a lot, so I have absolutely nothing to complain about with regards to this title. I do, however, have complaints about Kuro 2's title. In Japanese, Kuro no Kiseki 2 is just Kuro no Kiseki 2, and this is obviously localized as Trails Through Daybreak 2, because it would be very silly to change the translation mid-arc. What they don't do, though, is carry over the already in English subtitle again. It is called Crimson Sin, specifically with the N in Sin capitalized. And that's just not present in the English logo, which means it's not part of the title. Crimson Sin isn't just a cool tagline. Von Arkwright gets an evil counterpart in Kuro 2. And while in the first game they used the Kuro kanji from the title alongside the word Aoguroi to represent Von's color scheme as blue-black, this new evil counterpart uses the word Akaguroi, or dark red, reddish black. You know, crimson. Taking out the subtitle removes the whole fact that the crimson bad guy is a significant part of the game. Also, I can just say this because it's not a spoiler anymore. The English term Crimson Sin is title dropped in the game itself. So that's just something that's not going to exist anymore in the localization. Anyway though, we can finally move on to the last game, one that is currently unreleased even in Japan. Kai no Kiseki, Farewell O Zemuria, which seems to basically be the second coming of Trails into Revery, so that's kind of neat. We're going to talk subtitle first because, given precedent, this one is not going to survive to the localized version of the game. Farewell O Zemuria looks very cool in the logo, and also Kevin is back in this game, so that's pretty neat. But it is almost certainly going to have a double or even triple meaning. I can guess at a lot of those potential meanings, but in order to do so, I would need to spoil the entirety of the first two Daybreak games because obviously this follows up on those, and I'm not about to do that in a video releasing the same day Daybreak 1 does. What I will do though is tell you that this game is partially space travel themed, so until you finish Daybreak 2, you can view Farewell O Zemuria in the most innocent direct reading of a rocket will be leaving the surface of the planet at some point and saying farewell to Zemuria because it will be in space. That is definitely the only meaning that phrase will have, I promise. Anyway though, the kanji used in this title is this one, which means world or boundary on its own. More significantly though, you probably know the word sekai, which could mean world or even up to universe, and this kanji is the kai in sekai. I'm definitely thinking they're cooking something by using the first kanji from the word for dawn in the first two games, and then the second kanji from the word for world or universe in the third game that's about space travel, but I'm gonna need to actually play Kai to understand any of this. The important thing though is that this name is about transcending boundaries and leaving the world, so you could sort of view it as Farewell O Zemuria in Japanese and then Farewell O Zemuria in English as the full title. The more important thing though is probably the boundary meaning, because we don't know if the non-English part of the title is referring to the same thing as the English part. So it seems like some sort of boundary will be crossed. Like, I don't know, maybe the capital B boundary? That is a very important plot point in a couple other games, and seems like it's going to become relevant again in this upcoming Calvert arc? Yeah, that's probably a good idea. That, though, is why I am referring to this game in English as Trails Across Boundaries. Trails Beyond Boundaries, or Trails Beyond the Boundary, works just as well, but I want to save the preposition beyond specifically for the final game in the series. After Kai, we're getting pretty close to the end, to the point where I don't think there are more than 5 more Trails games left until the series is over, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's 1, 2, or 3 game arc and then one finale game to end the entire series on. Basically, I need them to do something really cool for the title of the final game, and that is call it Kiseki no Kiseki. Use the other kanji, so instead of Trails of Trails, it's Trails of Miracles. And then the English title can be The Legend of Heroes Trails Beyond Miracles, hopefully including whatever subtitle the Japanese version of the game had, because that is a suitably grandiose and epic name for the end of such a long saga. Happy 20th anniversary Trails series, and happy official release Trails through Daybreak. I'll see you in the next video, be it Trails, Xeno, or something else. Until then, this is Luxon, signing off.